I am really proud to present HAS member and my husband, David Couch, on the class today, The Magic of the United States Electric Grid. He served for 22 years as a senior vice president and chief information officer for Spartan Nash Corporation, where he is responsible for all business systems, technical infrastructure, and communication technology. He's got over 50 years of experience in these areas. He holds a BA and MA degrees from the University of Arizona. I also want to add just a little personal bio on him here. He tells me when he was 6, he loved playing with electricity, and he blew his first fuse when he was 6 years old.
And by the way, it was a fuse.
It was fusing. When I first met him, I was kind of shocked. Electricity is a mystery to me, so he would always look at the end of a wire to see what the wire would do for him, and I always thought that was kind of interesting. And then most recently, 2 or 3 years ago, he got his dream appointment. He is now a member of the board for the Holland BPW. So he gets to learn all about the electrical grid here and how it interacts with the United States. So he talked about this, I think it was during the pandemic, and there was a high interest in the electric grid because Texas was having this huge problem. And so there was a big request on why are they having problems and nobody else. And since then, a lot has changed. He's gotten a lot of knowledge working with the Holland BPW and his personal studying. So I think you're going to find this conversation and discussion a lot of fun. So welcome, David.
Okay, thank you very much. It's always a little scary when your spouse introduces you. First of all, well, a little bit of a comment. After 50 years of computers, I wanted to do something else. And so as she said, I've always had a fascination with electricity. And so this is sort of my retirement avocation, maybe, I don't know. The other thing I need to state up front is I'm in no way representing Holland Board of Public Works. That's a passion and a love and so forth, but this is not about them. We'll talk about them, but it's not meant to promote anything with BPW or anything like that. So just want to make that clear. So the other comment I'll make is I have a lot of material, and so I would ask to hold questions at the end. Because I'm going to fill probably 80 minutes out of the 90. But I've also we sent out a message to people. I will stay as long as people want to talk about, because there's lots of topics. There's lots of interest. I'm going to talk about how things work, but some of the other dynamics that you hear discussed about the grid, I don't necessarily cover, but I can cover. I can pretty much talk about, I'll tell you when I don't know. But if you want to talk about AI data centers, and if you want to talk about consumers' power, Palisades, I can talk about all those things. But that's not going to be the focus of the presentation. The focus is in a non-engineering way to educate you on how the U.S. electrical grid works. That's my mission. Okay, so just so everybody knows up front. So let's see. Let's hope. Yep, okay. So we're going to talk about the basic principles of electrical systems. Because this is not an engineering class, we're not going into too much detail. I'm just going to give you a high-level view of some of the principles of electrical system. We're going to talk about the Holland BPW grid. We're going to talk about the Michigan grid, the national electrical grid, and the management of it. And then we'll finish up with energy markets. Things were deregulated a number of years ago. And so there's energy trading that goes on every day, all the time across the country. And we're going to talk about the dynamics of that and how that works. And then wrap it up. So the principles of electrical systems, we're going to talk about if you look at, you'll see in this talk on several occasions, the electrical grid is divided up into generation, transmission of electrons, and distribution to our homes and businesses. It's basically 3 fundamental pieces. So I'm going to talk about those 3. I'm going to talk about your house and how your house enters into the equation and how that all works. So 2 things up front, and I'm not going to get into an engineering discussion about this. There's 2 types of electricity. There's DC electricity, direct current, which is if you have a battery operated anything, a flashlight, your cell phone, a hearing aid, any a transistor radio, any of those things run on what's called DC current. And it's typically with a battery system. Um, and even electrical cars now, we can say the same thing. The battery systems are DC. So what that means is the electrons flow in one direction. They flow off the negative pole and go to the positive pole, and one-way flow. Very simple. Lots of limitations, but is simple for a lot of devices. Then there's alternating current. Alternating current is when you plug into your house, that's what you get. And in that case, the direction, instead of all flowing in one direction, the electrons alternately flow in two directions, back and forth. And they do it 60 times a second. So every 60 seconds, the stuff that you plugged into the wall, the electrons are going one way, and then the other way, and then the other way, back and forth 60 times a second. Now, there's other AC systems that run 400 hertz. There's lots of different, but the common thing that we all live with is a 60 cycle system. And you'll see as we start talking about the grid, how that's divided up and works. So the other thing is kind of a simple thing, but it's a real man discovered that instead of having a generator create one circuit, that they could divide it up into 3 circuits. And so that every time a generator did one revolution, it could drive 3 different circuits. So in the little animation over on the right, there's an A circuit, which is the 2 blue leads, the B circuit, 2 red leads, and the C circuit, which are the green leads. So the fundamental electrical system, especially in large cases, and if you look up in the large transmission towers, you always see 3 wires, and it's because it's 3 phases. It's more efficient to generate, it's more efficient to transmit, and it's a more efficient way of doing things. So I'm not going to talk in any more detail about it, but I just wanted you to know that as you look around and you see 3 wires, that's why you see 3 wires. If you only see 1 wire, then they've taken like down a residential area. You don't need all 3 phases for the houses, so they'll just take 1 and drive houses either from the pole or the ground. So 3 phases. Then there's a fundamental thing called a transformer. A transformer is what makes all this stuff work. And all it is a device that you put in a certain voltage and you get out either a lesser voltage or a greater voltage. And why that's important is, and using the diagram at the top, a typical generator in a power plant puts out about 12,000, I think Holland Energy Park is 13,800 volts. But if you were to try and transmit that on a long distance, the loss and so forth, it would be very inefficient. And so what they do is they use a transformer and kick that voltage up to 345 to 500,000 to 700,000. And then they can send that electricity for miles and do it in efficient fashion. So then when they want to get to your house, they'll go to a substation near your house, and you can see them around the BP system, the BPW system and consumers. They'll bring the high voltage into a step-down transformer that brings it down for distribution along the streets from where we live. And then the last thing is they'll do a step-down transformer to bring it into our home. And so they'll either on the far right pictures, you'll see a pole mounted. So if your house is fed from a pole, the wires coming into your house, it's on, looks like a can, if you will. And that might serve maybe 3 homes, maybe 5, or it has a pad mounted transformer that you see in more modern times when they bury wires so that the trees don't cause them to cause an outage and so forth. And so in either of those cases, they might feed 4 to 5 homes, depending on the size and so forth, and the size of the transformer. So transformers are very important. The engineering of how they work doesn't matter. It's just really important to understand that changing the voltage allows the system to be more efficient as they transmit over distances. Make sense? Okay. Then, now this is the fun part. Up until recently, the grid has no storage. Now, with renewables, that's changing. We'll talk more about that later. But fundamentally, whatever we all as consumers draw out of the grid, the folks producing the electricity have to put the exact same amount into the grid. Otherwise, if it gets too out of whack, it'll collapse. And that's what, by the way, almost happened in Texas in 2021 because they were idiots, but that's another conversation. In Texas, I'll digress a little bit. In Texas, well, you'll see, is this permeate the conversation as we go along. Texas wanted to be different and wanted to be separate, and all they cared about was cheap electricity. They didn't care about reliability. They didn't care about a whole lot of things, and that bit them when a really nasty cold storm came in 2021, and the whole thing almost collapsed. Well, I'll throw some other tidbits in. I mean, that can be a discussion by itself. So keeping the grid in balance, the way this works is you have generation on the upper left, you have consumption on the lower right. And so if what you're putting in equals what's coming out, you hold that 60 hertz stable. If all of a sudden you have more coming in than going out, the frequency starts to go up. And our toasters, our air conditioners, are all the devices that we plug into an outlet can only handle a certain range. And if it falls outside of that range, you're in trouble. And so if the flow of less is less than what's coming out, you've got a problem as well. The frequency falls down. In the US and Canada, the standard voltage is 120 with an allowable range of about 115 to 126. So when you plug in that outlet at home, you're going to see that kind of range. And it's interesting, some of the games we have electric cars in our house and air conditioners, and anyhow, we've strained our transformer in our neighborhood a couple times. So going back to that basic structure is you've got generation, the gray or black over on the left-hand side. You've got transmission, lots of different voltages. And we'll worry about those later. And then you've got distribution to factories and household and so forth in the green. So fundamental three pieces. Make sense? Okay. Then you've got sources. And there's a variety of sources. So solar, lots of discussion about solar. Solar is great as long as the sun is shining. When the sun's not shining, you might have a problem. If the sun's shining a lot, you could have a problem. We're going to see that later. Same way with wind. Is wind always moving, or is the wind always there or not? And so they're very erratic sources. They're very climate-friendly sources, but they have a lot of dynamics that makes them difficult when you put them into this bigger mix. So then you have geothermal, and that's using the heat of the earth. They bore down at the earth and take the hot heat that's coming off from the molten core and use it to generate steam and drive generators and generate electricity. There's not a lot of it, but in certain parts of the world and certain parts of the country, it's a viable alternative. Hydro, sorry. We have a little bit of it in Michigan. There's been recent consumers had 13 dams they just sold to somebody else. We can talk about that if you like, latest in the news. But in the Northwest, which you'll see in a map later, hydro is the primary source of electricity. Biomass, we have that going on right here. Every place you see one of those big mounds of all of our garbage, they throw off methane gas. And so you can see it up around Coopersville. You can see it out here east of Drenth. There's landfills, and they produce methane, and they pipe the methane off those landfills, burn it as gas, or use it as gas to burn generators and generate electricity. And we use some of that BPW. The Zealand Farm Services uses that heat as part of their processes and so forth. So there's pipes running around to do all that. Gas. So most of the generation that's going on in the country now is moving towards gas. It's cleaner than coal, but it's not, it throws off CO2, so there's a problem. but it's much more efficient and so forth. And that's what all the generators that we have in BPW are all gas driven. And I'll go into more details about that. Nuclear, we have 3 nuclear power plants in the state. They're very powerful. There's lots of drama around nuclear, and there's lots of research that's going on in nuclear, which actually I'm going to do a class next year on that. But anyhow, so it's a source, and it's a very good source. There's fossil fuels. We all know about coal. We all know about consumers' power and closing down the Campbell plant and so forth. Coal has become very costly to run versus gas plants and other plants. And so that's why the country, regardless of what the politics of Washington, D.C. says or this or that, it's just more expensive to run a coal plant than a gas plant. And then finally, battery storage. And battery storage is sort of like the juxtaposition to the solar and wind. Battery storage is just now coming in, and that's the key with wind and solar, is when the wind's blowing, if you don't need it all, you want to store it. And same way with the solar, if the sun's out, you have more than you need, you want to store it so you can use it later. A very key component of the renewable mix. A little bit about the transmission network. So you can see a map of the transmission network in Michigan. And then I put in there a diagram on the upper right that if you're driving around and you see power poles, you can tell how much the voltage is in general by their design. So over in the far left, the lattice type architecture, those are typically 345 million volts up to about 7. Typically, they don't go about 750. 750 you would see around a large city like Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland or whatever. In around Holland, the second pole from the right is what the loop that Holland BPW runs, and that's a 138 volt system. And they have the 3 phases are on alternating sides of the pole. And then again, the transformers are what pushes it up, pushes it down, and so forth. Distribution network, this is what you should be somewhat familiar with in your neighborhood. So you have a substation somewhere nearby, and that's in the upper left. And then you come down to the middle on the right-hand side, again, those pole transformers or pad transformers. So that substation on the left brings it down into a voltage range, and all of the other devices, I don't have time to go in, but some are switches, some are things to deal with lightning. So if a lightning strike hits, you get in your house, you'll get a blink. And that's what's done. There's a thing called a recloser, which is like a circuit breaker. The circuit breaker, it pops because of the energy. But then after a few seconds, it kicks back on under the assumption that it was a lightning strike or a limb hit a wire and so forth. And so it's a way for the grid, the distribution network to recover from incidents that occur. Lots of different stuff. We don't have time to go into details. And then there's your house. So your house is fed on the upper left by one of the 2 types of transformers. It comes in the meter, and the meter allows us to measure the number of electrons that are coming either into your house, or if you have your own solar or whatever, out of your house. And so that's a key measuring point. Meters have gotten much smarter now. Most all of them have cellular or wireless networks, so they can tell the utility on an hourly basis what your demand is. And that's how, when you look at outage maps, they can tell where outages are, because the meter says with its last breath, just before it dies, it says, I'm out. And so anyhow, so that's been a nice upgrade to they call it the smart grid. Anyhow, so there's electric meter, and then you have a circuit breaker panel, and that's just an opened up panel. And so you got the three leads coming in the top, and then breakers and circuits going out, and you have large circuits for air conditioners and the stove and a car if you've got a battery or a electric car, and smaller ones for outlets and lights and so forth. And so that's kind of how it gets into your house and gets distributed to the devices in your home. All make sense? Okay. So now let's talk about Holland BPW. It's a municipal-owned utility, and there's basically three types of utilities that you see across the country. There are what are known as investor-owned utilities, which are public companies, and their stock is traded on the stock market. So they're a public company and they're going to make a profit. There's municipal utilities that are owned by cities. So the city, in the case of Holland, they were very progressive back in the 1800s, and they said, we're going to have our own utility. And the idea is that if they run the utility, they can run it cheaper and offer a lower price to the customers in the community. And in fact, in the case of BPW, your rates versus me being on the north side and consumers are about 40% less. You're paying 40% less at your house if you're on BPW than you're on consumers. And the manufacturers in the area, the businesses, they're paying about between 30 and 20% less than what they would be if there was consumers. And that's part of what makes Holland such an attractive place for industry, is because, I mean, it's just one thing, but it's significant in terms of the savings for a place like a battery plant. So Holland BPW has four services. There's the electric service, there's water, there's wastewater, and now there's communications. We're only going to talk about the electric side. In my first comment, I left that in. I did that. I put that in there long before I got involved with the BPW. So that's, again, I'm not representing BPW, but I've looked at a lot of utilities, and you are very lucky to be served. And I've worked with a lot of very large corporations in my career. And now that I'm sort of on the inside and see how the place operates, it's amazing the 170 people that are part of that organization, how sophisticated they are compared to when I work for Hewlett Packard and some of these large companies. It's a very well-run organization. Okay, generation has two sets of generating facilities, the Holland Energy Park and on the 48th Street across from Hayworth and Transmatic. There's a peaker plant that are outside. We'll talk about those. They have external sources, and they do invest in renewables. And they have transmission, not transmission in the greater architecture, but just how we service. There's a 24-mile loop of 138 volt lines that run around the city that provide distribution. We'll look at that in detail. And then we have an interconnection of the grid. The interconnection is out 112th and Chicago Drive by what we call by the water tower. And then they have a significant distribution system, which we'll talk about. And they're a member of the Michigan Public Power Agency. What MPPA is an organization that allows all these community utilities to act in a larger fashion, buy in bulk, and be able to compete with the investor-owned and the other utilities. It gives them more buying power and negotiating power. So MPPA is a real important part of the equation. So let's talk about Holland Energy Park. Holland Energy Park has won awards. It's incredibly efficient. It's really well designed. It's an amazing facility. So we're going to talk about how it works. All right. So there are four fundamental components. So the first thing is there are two Siemens SGT 800s, which are combustion turbines. It's basically a jet engine mounted on the floor. And they each one generates 50 megawatts. That in the utility world, that's kind of small, but it's great. And so the design, so you see, I tried to put a graphic up top that sort of talks about what's going on inside versus what it looks like on the outside. So if you look at the cabinet on the lower left, inside that box is the jet engine. And the round thing at the back far left is actually the generator. And so if you go on and look up at the top, the way that thing works is truly like a jet engine. You put air into it through an air intake, and that's the thing that sits on top. Draws in air, and like a jet engine, the initial fins compress the air so it's denser. Then they introduce natural gas, and they light it. And that combination of compressed air and gas burns. And that then turns the back half of the turbine and cause it to spin. And there's all kinds of, it's fascinating about how you start them up, how you shut them down. You can't let them rest because the metal will sag over time. And so there, I mean, there's just, they're amazing machines. And these are small machines, by the way. So that jet engine and the gas that you introduce can drive up to 50 megawatts. So then the exhaust coming out of that jet engine is between 2,500 and 3,000 degrees. So in what's called a single cycle gas turbine, that just goes to waste and goes out in the atmosphere. But if you want to be really efficient, you take that 2,500 to 3,000 degree exhaust and put it in the middle unit. That thing is massive. A person sits maybe, I don't know, maybe about that tall in it. I mean, it's just, that thing is, I don't know, 40 feet high, 50 feet high, and the top of the stack is even higher. So what happens is you take that hot air that's coming out of the jet engine and you run it across pipes and you heat up the pipes and generate steam. And so that steam is then routed over to a third generator, which is a steam turbine, in this case, an SST 400, again, relatively small in big utility terms, and it generates another 45 megawatts. So you don't waste that heat is the point. And you take that heat and you efficiently drive another generator. So in the end, when the heat, the 2,000 to 3,000 degree heat comes out the stack, it's about 250 degrees. So you're not introducing a lot of heat in the atmosphere. Okay, so then the last thing that you can see when you drive by is a cooling tower. Now, this isn't the cooling tower that's in Zealand that creates plumes, because they designed it with that in mind, so they don't have to close the streets and all that stuff. And so you take after the steam has driven the generator, you run it through a condenser, which then takes the heat and transfers it to another loop that goes out to the cooling tower and dissipates the remaining heat and cools down the water so it can be driven into steam again from the second time. And what's unique in our particular case, and you can see the I don't know, turquoise colored pipes, then you drive it into snowmelt. And snowmelt, BPW has a contract with the city of Holland that they have to provide 70-degree water whenever it's necessary. It's a contractual relationship. So they even have a backup boiler that if for whatever reason the generators aren't running or they don't need to run that hard, they can still produce the hot water needed for snowmelt. And what's unique about all that is this whole system is about 65 of the BTUs of the energy put into that system for the gas and whatnot. It's about 65% efficient. That's like record territory in the generation world. The old coal-fired plant was 25% efficient. That's how dramatic they are different. And then another way of looking at this is you look at number one, and you can see those are the jet engines. You see the generators on top of the back, and you fire them up, and that fire and flame goes into those heat recovery systems, number two. And then from that, we generate steam that goes to number three to the generators. And so those three generators go out and feed the network, which we'll talk about later. And then after the steam is run, it goes into condenser number five. And that then transfers the heat to another link that goes out to the cooling tower and feeds the snowmelt system. And so one of the things that they learned was when they first started in the summertime, well, we don't need to run snowmelt. However, what happened was they had calcium buildup. So they realized they had to change the chemistry, and you ought to see the water purification in this facility so it doesn't affect the turbines and so forth, and the gas cleaning that has to go on to make sure there's no impurities into the system. It's amazing. Anyhow, so what they do now is during this time of year, the snowmelt is running at about 5 pounds per square inch or 5 psi. In the wintertime, it's 35 psi. So they still circulate water, but just not at the same rate and under the same pressure. Okay? All right. So this is the backside. On the left is a backside picture of Holland Energy Park. And so you can see those two square boxes kind of halfway up the building. That's the air intake from those two generators. And then the two stacks are that you see in the silhouette. That's where the exhaust from the heat recovery systems flow out. And then if you turn around and stand in the building and look the opposite way, you'll see there's three transformers that take those three generators and crank the power up from 13,800 volts to 138,000 volts. And then that's packaged up and put on, again, three lines, three phase. That goes out, travels out by 31 and onto James Street and down to James Street and into one of the substations. And that's how we get the power into the loop. Okay. So then there's also the peaker plant. Now, Holland Energy Park is designed to be running 24 hours a day. Those things, it's for what's called baseload generation. But what happens in the peak? What happens in the summer when everybody's got their air conditioners running and the plants or the factories are all running and we get peaks? So there are three other generators that are on the south side. There's two smaller ones, 35 megawatts, GE frame 6Bs. And then there's one larger one, 84 megawatts in the back. And so those generators, they're from an EPA standpoint, they're licensed to run 10% of roughly 10% of the time, because most of the time they're not needed. And so when they run is when we hit a peak in Holland, or we're having to do maintenance on Holland Energy Park, or the grid needs more electricity. And we'll talk about how that happens. And we sell electricity on the grid. We have an overabundance of generating capacity right now. And so when there's in the pricing of the market, and we know how much it costs to generate a gigawatt or a megawatt of energy out of Holland Energy Park, those are licensed by hours, how long those generators run. These are licensed by start. So if after 1,000 starts, you have to do maintenance. Whereas on the other ones, after, I don't know, 10,000 hours, you do maintenance. So there's two different ways of measuring them. And so we know every time we start it up, that's getting closer to requiring maintenance. So we know the cost implications. And so these generators are used when we need extra energy or when it's profitable for us to sell electricity on the market. And that profitability, just a little snippet, when they built Holland Energy Park, they issued 20-year bonds to pay for interest and so forth to pay for it. Because we've been able to sell so much energy on the grid, we paid off the bonds in 7 years. So last year, Holland Energy Park was paid for. Now it's just maintenance of an operation, but the initial investment, done. So these generators are simple cycle. You run gas in, same compressant, same jet engine kind of thing, older, not as fancy. But the hot air comes out the stack and you just release it in the atmosphere. They have a feature called black start in the utility business. What happens if the whole network collapses? What happens if something happens and we have to cut ourselves off from the grid? What do you do when there's no electricity? In order to start all this stuff, you need electricity to get it running. And so black start capabilities is the two 34 megawatt generators have the capability to start on fuel oil and have enough batteries and different things so we can start them with no energy. The world is dark and we're going to start them up. And so that's what black start is all about. We can run them on gas or fuel oil. And like I say, they're maintained by number of starts. So that's so then we use fuel. We have natural gas. We have natural gas runs all these things. Natural gas is supplied by the ANR pipeline. It comes up through Hamilton. And then we have our own pipe from that facility into Holland. And available on that pipe is natural gas from British Petroleum, DTE, or Constellation Energy. Probably 80% of what we consume or use comes from BP. And actually probably 70% and 20% from DTE. And we just recently added Constellation Energy, maybe do 10% of our business. So we have diversity and we have a competitive pricing. So it puts us in a strong position. And so those are the sources that we can get off that pipe. So here are all the sources, and I'm not going to go into this detail, but sort of the big picture here is, you see the yellow, those are our owned resources. And then we have a contract with a DTE generation plant over in Detroit, east side of Detroit. And we have 35.6 megawatts that we can buy from them that we're contracted. Actually, we own part of that percentage. It's like 5 or 10%. And so we have rights to that power. And then we have 3 different wind farms over now. Gets a little dynamic things, different. These are different contracted resources, but we own a percentage of the BB wind farm, the Wildcat wind farm, Pegasus, and you can see the amount that we generate there. We do some natural gas, landfill gas from a couple different locations, and then we have some solar from some different projects. So in theory, we have access to 443 megawatts, 0.7 megawatts. The catch with all of this is nameplate voltage or nameplate capacity. The likelihood of solar in Michigan running full bore is not high. Wind, is it running, those turbines can generate that amount of electricity, but is there that much wind at any given point in time? Those jet engines in Holland Energy Park, if it's in the middle of the summer, the air is already hot coming in. So you can't fire up enough of a flame, enough of a combustion to drive the generator as hard as it can go. Whereas in December, when it's 10 degrees out, you can run them till the cows come home. The problem is nobody's doing air conditioning. You don't need it, right? And so if you look at all sources of generation, there's always nameplate capacity and what's summer capacity. And so there's always a difference. So that's a mislead. I'm only saying that sort of as a gotcha. In theory, that's what's possible, but it's really not that possible. Okay. But that's just the nature of generation on the grid. Make sense? Okay. So that's what BPW does. And what this boils down to is about 15% renewables, 15 to 16% renewables. But we have no battery system. And that's a discussion point in the future. So how does all this happen? Well, there's a BPW, there's a control room. If you ever go take a tour through the Holland Energy Park, it's all controlled there. So you've got this demand. And so the demand in the lower left corner, it's called base load. So if you turn off your air conditioner, you're asleep at night, what does it take to run your house when you're not active? And the factories are quiet and it's in the middle of the night, the demand is very low. But whatever that base low is called in the utility world base load. Then you have things like, and you can see the time of day. You get into the middle of the day. If it's the summertime, it's your air conditioning. If it's a normal working day, factories are occupied. If they're only running one shift, retailers are open. So the maximum demand is always in the middle of the day. And I'll show you some graphs how you can look at all that. But anyhow, so they have to look at what's our demand, what did we forecast our demand was going to be, and then we have these different generating resources, and we know how much it's going to cost to run each of those resources based on their requirements. Then we're purchasing stuff off the grid, and we have these purchase agreements with these different things, and so we can bring in those. We know what the cost is there. We can purchase from the open market based on whatever the price is, and you'll see about that later. Or we could be selling to others. And so they balance that equation on an hour-to-hour basis, are dialing them up and dialing them down to meet the demands of our utility. So it's not a trivial task. It's amazing. I mean, if I got into detail, you'd have a heart attack. I mean, it's amazing all the different, you can't use too much gas. You got to, you paid for this much. You said you're going to use this much. If you use too much more, you're going to pay a premium. If you use too much less, you're going to pay a penalty. I mean, everything is measured and it's a market. And it's like when you go look at Holland Energy Park, when you look in there, aside from all the technology, it's an energy trading floor. It's relatively simple, but that's what it is. All right, so let's talk about the loop. This is the northern part of the loop. So you look at down at the bottom in the center is Lake Makatawa. And you can see there's and sorry for the graphics, but I was trying to get the whole picture. So you got the Holland Energy Park, and you see that green line that goes up the center and goes to the left to the James Street substation. And so if you go from the James Street substation down across the bridge and to the Pine substation down there on the lower left, and then it goes further south. It comes up the other side along Waverly, goes out to 112th and Lakewood, and that's the interconnection to the grid. And the grid, there's two lines that come in from the south, and there's two lines that come in from the north. We'll talk more about those later. And then it meanders around, and way up on Waverly, there's another substation. It gets up to Quincy, and there's a substation up on Quincy before 136. So that's the northern portion of the grid. This is the southern portion. So comes down from Pine on the upper left, comes out to, I think it's Ottawa in 17th or 18th or whatever. There's a substation there. And then you keep on going down to 31 and Washington by the McDonald's there. There's another substation. You go over to 48th Street where the peakers are. There's a substation there. And then it goes way down towards Hamilton, and there's a substation down there. And then you come back up, and there's a substation at LG. LG's demand is so great. We built a $15 million substation just for them. And I could go into lots of details. We won't have time, but I mean, they're a huge energy consumer. And then so you keep on going up Waverly and up by, 24th Street and Waverly, there's a substation, kind of got a wall around it. It's by the Gateway Mission. And then it goes on up. So that's the loop. It's 24 miles and it's 138,000 volts. Here's an example of one substation. Sorry, the picture isn't better, but it was a foggy day that day. It's before they blew up the old coal plant, had somebody go up and take a picture from the up top. So there's 11 substations connected to that loop. They convert the 138,000 volt transmission down to 12,000 volts. And they connect between 10 and 12 above or below ground distribution circuits that go out to the various homes and factories and so forth. There's a network about 600 circuit miles. We serve about 30,000 customers. If you look at the Google picture on the right, you'll see at the very top, you'll see a pole, and that's where the 138,000 volt loop comes in on the left-hand side, and it goes through some circuit breakers and switches, and eventually goes down to a large silver-looking thing, which is a transformer. And then across the bottom are a row of distribution switches that go out to our homes and factories. And then on the other side, you'll see another transformer, and then you'll see where the loop comes back out. So it comes in and comes out. And every one of those substations is designed so that no one transformer handles the whole. There's two transformers, but if one were to go away, you can supply all the energy coming out. So they always have a 50% margin on each transformer. So if one dies, the other one can handle the load. So, and they all look like that. Then there's a white square at the bottom, and that's where all the control systems are. And so there's control systems, there's racks of, it looks like a small computer room of racks of equipment that are tied to each one of these things that are monitoring. So if anything goes awry, and there's a central control that can see all that stuff and manages it and makes sure it stays safe. So then how do we connect to the outside world? So that loop represent on the left-hand side, power comes into a substation that's out at 112th in Lakewood. And that substation is where we connect into the grid. And so there's 238,000 circuits that come in from the south, who knows where. And there's 138,000 circuit that goes to the north, and there's 138,000 that goes to Consumers Campbell plant, to one of the substations outside of the Campbell plant. Because we had a contract with Campbell that I think it was 30 megawatts or something that we got, and it was for years to provide energy from that plant. Regardless of how all that turns out, I know there's all sorts of drama about it, and we can talk in detail if you want. What's going to happen is that plant will eventually go away. Consumers don't want to have anything to do with it because it's so costly to run. And what'll happen is they'll come in, they'll remediate it, the plant will be gone, but all the connections, that's a huge opportunity to have that much connection to the grid. What will happen, I'm happy to sign something, although nobody's said anything. There's going to be a big battery facility that's going to be out there because of all that grid connection and the need for renewables. They'll build, I don't know, I have no special information, but I'll bet you $100 there's going to be, when that thing's gone, there'll be and batteries don't take, a few acres. It won't be a big deal. So anyhow, the getting new connections into the grid is very difficult. And so the fact that all those connections exist, they're not going to just say, see ya. They're going to use it. All right, so let's talk about Michigan electricity providers. So there's investor-owned, there's cooperatives, there's municipal, and I'll talk a little bit about the mix in Michigan. So this is a map of all the different service providers in Michigan. I'm only going to talk about 3. So yellow, that is consumers. That sort of bluish, teal, whatever you want to call it, that's DTE. And then the little orange down in the corner is the Indiana Michigan Power Company, and that's just an upper portion of their grid. And it is there's the Cook nuclear power plant there is quite sizable, and then there's an old coal-fired plant that's in downtown Michigan City. Then there's electrical cooperatives. Cooperatives are in rural areas. A bunch of communities will get together and build a facility and distribute energy and so forth. And there's many of them in the state, and they're kind of sprinkled around. And then there's the municipals. There's 40 municipal utilities in the U.S. Or in the state of Michigan. They service about 300,000 customers. The largest is Lansing. They have about 100,000 customers. Smallest is Daggett up in the UP, 200 customers. BPW is the second largest by both number of customers and our energy demand. And BPW has a wonderful reputation, I've learned, in the industry. There's about 2,000 municipals in the country, and BPW is probably in the top 50 to top 10. Just have a great reputation. So where does our energy come from? What's the source? So now we've just flipped over from coal being the dominant to natural gas. So natural gas is sitting at 34%, coal at 30%, nuclear at 22%. You can see next is wind at 8%, solar is only 1%, and the hydro is 1%. So anyhow, that's what the mix looks like in the state. On the right-hand side, you'll see the mix of renewables. So your wind is about 77%. You can see hydro, I think, is next at 9%. And biomass is next at 7%, and it goes down from there. So in terms of, and these are 2022 data and 2021 data. So it's getting data, I only have so many sources, and so that just gives you a picture. So let's talk about the national grid. And we're talking about the history, regions, and regulations. So how it all started was back in 1882, Thomas Edison created a DC power system. It was deployed in New York, the Pearl Street Station. They measured it in those days in the number of lamps because that was the only thing they had. And so they had 400 lamps and 85 customers. That was the initial system. The key with those DC systems, the electricity could only go about a mile. It was so inefficient that a generating system was defined by a circumference of basically a radius of 1 mile. So then, 2 years later, they had expanded. Were up to 10,000 lamps and about 508 customers. And then some other locations around Pennsylvania and Massachusetts started coming along. And then Tesla got involved. And if you want some great movies, being the geek that I am, the Current Wars was a pretty accurate description, a little bit of dramatization, but not bad, about Tesla versus Edison. And it's real interesting. They're Devil in the White City in Chicago about the World's Fair in whatever it was, 1896. That's when Tesla, they wired it all up in AC, first time it ever happened. Everybody thought everyone was going to die with AC, and there's lots of stories. Anyhow, in Niagara Falls in 1895, they built the first AC system. And I don't know the distance, but they transmitted it, I think, 30 miles to Buffalo. And that was the first time that was ever done. And so that ran for many years. So then what happened was, because these small DC systems and wealthy people would have their own generator and their own lights and blah, 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 it became incredibly complex with lots of little systems, and they weren't all the same, and the standards were varied, and it was just crazy. And so all of a sudden people woke up and said, you know what, we've got to standardize this thing. So around 1914, 43 states got together and they built a regulatory commission to oversee the standardization of all this stuff. And so the first federal regulation, of course, Texas had to opt out. We'll see more about that later, because heaven forbid the government should have any involvement there. In 1935, that's when they started the structure. And so then things in the 60s, things grew a lot and so forth. And then in the 70s and really in the 90s is when deregulation occurred. And they said, as opposed to you owning generation, distribution, and transmission, they broke them apart and said, there's going to be folks that have generation capability, there's going to be folks that have transmission capability, and there's going to be folks that have distribution capability. And we're going to make it a competitive pricing market. And so fundamental change occurred. It took a long time, but it drove where we are today. And we created some national standardization. I'll talk a little bit about that. So that's how it started. And that's exactly why that's what New York City used to look like. Because of all those separate DC systems and the fact that they could only go a mile, every one of those poles had 4, 5, 10, 20 different utilities on it. And it was crazy. And they eventually go, you know what, this ain't gonna work. And so then all that evolved. So let's talk about the grid structure. They're called interconnections. There's the Eastern Connection, which is east of the Rockies. There's 8 regional councils that oversee it. There's 32 load balancing authorities that are monitoring that balance, that 60 cycle balance. In the winter, it has a demand of about 650 gigawatts. That's a lot of electricity, by the way. In the summer, it goes up to 750. So again, air conditioning, demands, and so forth. It makes a huge difference. We all like, when one of the Sahas classes talked about refrigerated air. We all like refrigerated air. The Western interconnection is west of the Rockies. There's 37 balancing authorities, but you can see they're much smaller at 125 gigawatts in the winter and 150 gigawatts in the summer. Why? Because of the population east of the Rockies and the industry east of the Rockies versus west of the Rockies. So then the minor interconnection, of course, is Texas. They wanted their independence. They didn't want anybody telling them what to do. So they created one balancing authority, electric reliability. The fact that the reliability is in their name is highly questionable. Council of Texas, they have a demand of about 65 gigawatts in the winter and 75 gigawatts in the summer. It serves 60% of the land area and about 90% of the consumption. And then you go up to Canada and Alaska, and there's interconnections up there. We won't talk about those. So that's what the country looks like. And so if you go back to that 60 cycle thing I was talking about, if you're up in Minnesota and you plug in and you get your 60 cycles, and you're down in Miami, you get the same 60 cycles. They're synchronized. Okay. It's the same thing. If you're in Seattle and you're down in San Diego, it's the same 60 cycles. If you're in Denver and you're in Grand Rapids, they're different 60 cycles. They're totally independent systems. And Texas, of course, has its own. So in order to make this work, they have converter facilities that they'll take AC in, convert it to DC, and go across to the other grid and convert it back into AC. And so it's probably dated by now, but it just shows you how they can interconnect and move energy back and forth as needed. Okay. Also notice that there's only two for Texas. Texas, because they didn't want to be regulated, they have minimal interconnections. So when they were on the ropes in 2021, nobody could help them because we don't want to be regulated and so forth. And it was all about low cost. Well, don't worry about reliability. And I can tell you stories. I mean, we have some friends that lived there at the time. They talk about every year they have to make a decision about who they're going to get their energy from. And it's like a bidding war. And, so that's how the grids compare graphically. Kind of gives you an idea of the difference. So regulations, there are a lot of energies, but there are two that really matter. Federally, FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. There are others, nuclear plants, the nuclear regulatory, there's Department of Energy and so forth. But those first two are ones that really matter. And then in the states, there's state regulators too, the Public Utilities Commission, which we'll talk about. So they regulate a lot of things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but they, interstate commerce, the managing transactions, managing the money movement, enforcing reliability standards, a lot of things that they're responsible for. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it because there's other things to talk about. But FERC is good. And of course, the current administration's trying to screw all that up, but we'll see. And then there's NERC. NERC's really important. NERC came about after the 1965 blackout that occurred on the East Coast. I remember that as a kid. I think I was 14. They set up an independent company to set standards for all utilities in the country. And so they have very specific standards. How often you trim trees, all these different things that you have to, it's a long list. So they developed the reliability standards, design rules, operating rules, maintenance rules. They assess both seasonal and long-term reliability. They monitor the bulk transfer of power. They establish rules for the whole buying business, rules for generators, education, training, certification. It's very comprehensive what they do. And what they do is very important. And I love to make fun of Texas, sorry, but in 2011, NERC came in and did a study for the first time of the Texas grid. And they did a laundry list of recommendations. What did Texas do? They didn't implement any of them. And so in 2021, they almost lost it. And after 2021, they all said, maybe we ought to pay attention to that. Maybe it's not just cheap electricity. Here's a great example. When you're stressed on power, you've got all these circuits I've talked about. So what are the circuits you care about? Police, hospitals, anything that's critical to the infrastructure. Us residents, rolling blackouts, sorry, we got to keep the fundamental capabilities together. And for example, if you have a gas pumping station that's keeping the pressure up on the gas line that feeds your generator, probably ought to be critical too. Texas didn't have any of that documentation. As they were collapsing and they were doing rolling blackouts, they were shutting down circuits that powered the gas pumping stations that were pumping gas into the utilities. And so they were just shooting themselves in the foot. It goes on and on. I'm sorry. On the state side, the State Public Utility Commission, they regulate retail sales. They're responsible for approving siting of new generation facilities, distribution facilities, et cetera. And states vary widely in their regulation. MPSC is the Michigan version. regulates privately owned utilities, of which there are 8, basic oversight, member regulated cooperatives, all that stuff. However, in the case of municipals, they don't control our rates. Why don't they control our rates? Because the city controls our rates. The cities own us, and the cities want to do right by the community that they serve. And so the MPSC we don't get involved. And so that's part of why we have 40% less cost in the Holland, is because we follow what the city wants us to do. And so that's the guiding light, and that's what makes the difference. So they don't have to watch us. Management of the grid. We'll talk about reliability management, demand management. Utility. We'll talk about a utility, a region, interconnect, transmission, all this stuff. All right. So let's talk about demand. So what you see is a diagram or a graph of time of day. And starting from midnight and going to midnight the next day. So in a general philosophical view, there's this base load that I described. And the factories are closed. It's the middle of the night. We're all sleeping. And what is the base load that we are required to keep the lights on? And so that's sort of one design thought. So then there's an intermediate load that's relatively constant but can vary. And then there's peak load. And peak load is prime time during the day. If it's the summertime, there's air conditioning running, the factories are running, the retail stores are open, and that's when you tend to have your peaks. And then if you're going to design one of these things, you want to have a cushion. You want to have what happens if something goes wrong. You need to have extra capacity. And all these NERC and all these people have tests and things we have to certify every year. What's our typical demand and what's a certain margin, and we have to crank it all up and prove that we can do it every year. BPW, all the utilities have to do that. So then let's look at the seasonality, because that plays an amazing difference. So again, midnight to midnight, springtime, you don't have hot, you don't necessarily have a lot of cold. And so you have the dip at night when everybody's asleep, but then it's pretty level during the course of the day. In the fall, it's getting colder. And so you typically have more heat that you have to provide in the fall than you typically do in the spring. In the winter, you have a heating issue. And the other thing that happens is when everybody comes home from work or gets up in the morning, gets ready to go to work, and then they come home at night and come home from work. And so it creates these 2 humps. In the summertime, it's all about that refrigerated air. And so you can see the difference of a given utility. I can't remember where this is from, but it's a map or a diagram of what you would typically see. I mean, everybody's different, but just to let you know that seasonality makes a difference. So how are you going to satisfy the demand? Well, you've got nuclear, and we'll talk a little bit about these power plants and how they can respond. Typically, nuclear provides that base load. You fire them up and you keep them running. They don't vary. We'll see more about that later. Natural gas, it can respond. Hydro dams, you can let more water out or not let as much water out, so they can respond. Imports, you can bring imports in from elsewhere in the grid. What we got? Biomass, that doesn't vary a lot. You got wind, that doesn't vary a lot. And then solar, look at what solar does. In the prime part of the day, it can provide a lot. However, it can provide more than you need. And if you provide more than you need, you're just going to dissipate that, not introduce it into the system, and it's wasted. And that's where a battery comes in, both in the case of wind and so forth. So just kind of a sample chart of how things might look. So here's the interesting part. So you have all these monster machines that run, and they have characteristics that when you're trying to balance this stuff, all these characteristics play into it. So let's look at the 3 statistics. One is from minimum load, what's the lowest level I can run that generator of its 100% capacity? So A hydro, so that's the first thing is what's the lowest it'll go, how, these big engines turning these shafts and so forth, you have to generate a certain amount of electricity. Otherwise it's not efficient and it just doesn't work. Trying to move all that stuff. So that's one number. And the next number is to me the most important is how quickly can you change? So it says, what is the percentage change that I can make in this source of generation in a minute? In other words, how fast can I move it up or how fast can I move it down? Okay. And then the last one is when I started at 0, how long does it take me to get it to go? At full bore. Is it full bore? Startup time? Yeah, I don't say that specifically. Okay. So hydro is very variable. You can open up the water and let it go, or you don't have to. So 5% is the minimum load that can run. And the ramp rate is pretty good. I can move 15% of my capacity in a minute. So I can move relatively fast. A gas turbine simple cycle that doesn't have that heat recovery piece, that can minimum load is about 15%. Again, that shaft and that mass of metal that you have to keep rotating, and what's the minimum level that you can run? You can't run it real slow or it doesn't work. And so there's a minimum level of 15%. Geothermal, 15%. Let's just go down the chart and look at nuclear. Nuclear, the lowest you can run nuclear is half power. And notice that in order to move nuclear, it's only 2% per minute. That means that it's going to take an hour to get from the lowest rate to the fastest. In other words, it's not responsive. And so the point in all of this is if you've got whatever mix of generation capacity you have, and you have to do this balancing act of making sure you're meeting demand, how much controls do you have and what makes sense to be able to service the need? So that's why in the case of nuclear, you fire it up and you let it run at full bore and it covers your base load. You don't screw with it. And so it just sits there and runs. Where these other things all have ways that you can increase or decrease. Make sense? It just adds to that complexity of, well, what am I going to do? So a little bit about the generation in the US. This is up through 2022. You see on the left, the brown or whatever color you want to call that, is the coal. And you can see how coal has dropped off the map because it's just not cost effective any longer, regardless of what some people think. Gas is the blue, and that's been filling in the gap. Nuclear is been fairly, it's ramped up and so forth, but it hasn't moved a lot. Renewables, you can see they're growing, but still not a big piece. And so that's what it looks like through 2020, probably 2021, I guess it is. And then if you look at the mix of renewables on the far right, you see that hydroelectric has been around for a long time, huge deal. You can see the solar at the very top. You can see wind has been been huge growth and so forth. So that's the reality of what exists. And then I like this chart. So this chart shows you in each state what is the largest source of power generation, what fuel is pushing it. So you look in the Northwest, it's all blue, that's all hydro, dams. The red is natural gas. The black is coal. You see a few yellows or orange, if you will, that are nuclear. And notice in the middle of, what is that, Kansas or Nebraska is wind. And same place in Iowa. So in terms of the mix around the country, that's what exists today. Or whatever, 2020, sorry, going. So then let's talk about batteries. So batteries are huge, and it's a huge growth area. In fact, LG here in town, they had phase 1, which they built a number of years ago, and they just finished phase 2. Phase 2 was built on the premise of EV batteries. Well, as EVs have kind of tailed off a little bit, not the demand that they were, they've pivoted, and they are now making utility batteries in phase 2 in that plant. And so So if you look at deployments, the winner in batteries for years has been California. After the Texas fiasco, they have an enormous amount of wind and solar in Texas, and regardless of what the governor said, um, they've now been the second largest deployer of batteries because they have so much renewables. They can now store it in batteries, and they've kept themselves out of hot water that they went through in 2021. They woke up. Arizona now is number 3. They're relatively recent. In fact, that facility on the lower left, that picture is an Arizona facility that just came online recently. 2026 was the largest growth in batteries. We expect that to slow with the new administration. It won't stop. Everybody knows what the right answer is, but they aren't going to help it. So anyhow, that's a transmission grid. Everybody ought to have one. And that's all the generators in the country, and there's some are nuclear and so forth. So how do you manage all this stuff? So they do huge modeling scenarios to see what do we expect things to happen, of what happens if we do this, what happens if we do that. That we have demand projections, and the things on the top are the things that can cause problems. Generation and the out of balance between the load and the generators, weather, most typically is a common. We had some facility breaks, and how do you balance that need? If there's cascading events, one thing, I mean, the outage in what was 2003, Ohio. There was a utility in Ohio that wasn't maintaining trees, and a tree got interacted with a transmission loop or a transmission line. It went down. It caused a bunch of energy to move over to 2 other distribution lines or transmission lines that were over a river, and they hadn't done good tree maintenance there. The lines overheated. They sagged, interact with trees. And then there was one of those monster transformers and circuit breakers was improperly programmed. And so one thing led to another thing, and the Midwest collapsed. Equipment failures, stability, markets, solar magnetic disturbances. We won't get into that, but the sun has a big effect on this. So with those are the kinds of things that can happen, what do? Well, they can dispatch move generation. Hey, you crank it up over here, you crank it down over there. Load management programs. You sign up for a thing that they'll put a device on your hot water heater or your air conditioner and shut you off when they have peak times. They can reconfigure the grid, reduce voltage, make public appeals. We've heard some of those in different times. And so those are all things that they have to control what's going on. So the final thing we're going to get into is independent system operators. So these are how the regions of the country are managed electrically. We are in what's called MISO. So that light blue, those states are managed by the mid-continent interconnection independent system operator. They're the ones, they manage the grid that is in Michigan and other states. So they control what we do. So with that, I mentioned earlier that when they deregulated in 1996, they said, we're going to break transmission and generation apart. We're going to have a real-time system that allows us to see, based on demand and availability, how much is a price of a kilowatt hour. And then each ISO, in our case, MISO, has their own system for buying and selling electricity. There's a 5-minute reporting. It basically says, here's what the cost is going to be 5 minutes from now, based on all of our forecasts. And there's day ahead. Based on what we see coming, this is what we think it's going to be a day ahead. And there's a price that you pay based on those projections. And so we have purchase power agreements with those other resources I mentioned in the earlier chart. MPPA, they allow us to buy in bulk, and so they manage those relationships. And so MISO is governing what goes on in Michigan and the interconnection, the price dynamics. And they have resource adequacy requirements. I mentioned one time a year, you have to say, here's what our demand is, and crank it all up, demonstrate that you can meet the demand and you have extra. If you don't have enough extra, you have to go on the market and buy. And there's an auction one time a year said, gee, you're stressed. And so BPW, because we have extra, last year we got $2 million by helping somebody else meet their adequacy requirements because we had extra. That's part of how we paid down the bonds. So here's a real time, and you can go out this tonight. I'm sure you'll be all on your machines, and look at any given instant what the price is for energy in this particular region. So you can see on the left, I did that March 31st, 2025. And you can see Michigan was $26.34. Minnesota was 30.32, but there was a problem in Louisiana. And in Louisiana, you were paying $185.30. So some generation facility was down, a transmission line was down. That system down there was stressed. And so they were willing to pay a heck of a lot of money if you could sell them some energy because they were in trouble. And that's where, in case like BPW, and sometimes if they're in trouble in a particular region, they'll call us up and say, turn it all on. And so so we contribute to that. So then I did it in September 9th, and you can see it was much more settled. There was a little action up in the Dakotas, but in general, the prices were much more stable across the grid, the MISO portion of the grid. Make sense? Okay, so how does all this work? I only got a couple more slides. So on the left-hand side is the Holland BPW grid. You got residential customers, you got business customers, and you got our fleet of generation capability, which we talked about earlier. And that all feeds into that $138,000 volt loop that we all draw on. And then at 112th substation, we interconnect to the MISO grid. And we own portions of these resources that we can draw on to get energy from the outside. So you would think that's how it works. But actually, the engineers like to say, electrons are going to flow to where they want to flow. You can talk all you want, but electron is going to, wherever it gets generated, it's consumption, whatever the closest consumption is, that's where the electron is going to go. So you can do all these games with money, but the physics are the physics. So that's the theory of how it works, but this is how it really works. So the left-hand side is the same. And the right-hand side is the MISO grid. And so you still have our contracted providers that we have up at the top, but you also have all the other resources, all the other stations, the solar, the power plants, and so forth, and they're all feeding the grid. They all have meters about what's coming in and what's going out. And we have a meter saying what's coming in and what's going out. So the actuality of how it works is that, not the other. Okay? And I know this is getting a little crazy, but I'm just trying to figure out a way to convey this. And so every day, MPPA and MISO send us an accounting for what we used and what we didn't use off the grid. And so every day we get an invoice. And so this is me summarizing an invoice. I just asked Dave, I said, pick a day. And so he sent January 17th, 2025. This is one day. So the Michigan Public Power Agency acts as our agent. They manage these contracts with these providers. We have purchase power agreements with these providers. And so this is an invoice, a summarized invoice for one day. In this particular day, we didn't use DTE. We didn't need it. It was the winter time. Demand wasn't high. So the contracted sources that we have over in DTE's Bell River facility, somebody else used it because we didn't need it. So we got paid because we didn't use it. Somebody else used it, and so we get paid. So for a day ahead, I talked about day ahead, we got somebody else used 718 megawatts, and we got $28,759 for that day from that source. And then real time, ongoing demand was 64 megawatts we didn't use, and that was $1,500. And you go on down, the only stuff we used was out of Fremont, that's down Toledo. It's a gas plant down there. So we used 86 megawatts, $3,000. We used some natural gas and so forth. And just, I picked this day. I said, give me any day. And this is a fun, it's one of these things like that. So this is highly summarized. But that particular day, BPW made $73,986 because of assets that we owned that we didn't need on that particular day, and somebody else needed them. And so we got paid. Now, I could have picked another day, and I mean, when I said pick a day, any day, and so it could have gone the other way. So last slide. It's been an incredible evolution over 140 years. It's one of the largest machines man has ever created. It's fundamental to our society. The market is driving, I mean, you can talk about politics and all the opinions everybody has about coal, blah, 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 and the character over in Hudsonville and all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is that it's not economical to burn coal anymore. It just doesn't make sense. It's not a, climate thing, although it's great for the climate to get rid of it, but it's a money thing. And if you call up the crazy person in Hudsonville is trying to get them to keep it open, he called up, I'm telling you more than you need to know. It's just, they called up the CFO of consumers and said, why don't you keep it open? It doesn't finance. The CFO said, it's crazy. Why would you do that? And so anyhow, but everybody's got their opinions. So we're going to moving to large scale renewables are going to require significant storage capabilities, balancing resources, and there's a transmission issue. A lot of the renewables are out on the western part of the country, and so what we need is more transmission from the west to the east to balance this out, and that takes a long time because nobody ever wants a power line to go over their house. So there's going to be significant transmit, and then there's a whole lot of zero carbon dispatchable technology. By the way, I can talk about any of these things. The rest of the time, ask me questions. We can talk. I'll bore you to tears. Burning hydrogen in the gas plant. Gas emits CO2. You can't do anything about that. So you can adapt these generators to burn hydrogen. Small nuclear power plants. I'm going to do a class next year on nuclear power and the evolution of the nuclear power markets and small modular nuclear reactors and what's going on in Palisades and so forth. And a lot of work to do. Anyhow, and there's carbon capture. Carbon capture isn't practical yet. It takes more energy to capture it than it does for the savings and so forth. So there's just a lot of stuff. And so that's my story. And I'm happy to talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about. Ask any questions. I have an opinion. It might be right, might be wrong, but I'm not shy. I think you have, sorry.
I just wondering, how does the grid tell you what you're going to get? So like on your day summary,
Yes.
It came out like maybe 5 places that you bought from.
Yes.
Why didn't it come from the other places?
They have meters everywhere. And so based on the grid management, MISO management, they can tell where the energy is moving. And so from that, I don't know the details. I've only learned so much, but they have a way of doing that. Oh, okay.
David, with 40% less being charged for BPW,
Yes.
what
Why?
kinds of restrictions are there from allowing others to be able to tap into that?
Oh, because they control the wires, right? And so you can't, and they have rate schedules. Here's a perfect, and so they have control to access that. So you can't just come in and connect up without having an official meter, an official connection. And so that's you couldn't. And here's an example.
By geography, they control it by geography?
Yeah, oh, sorry. Yes, that's logic. If the wire isn't there, and there's a thing in the state. So I have consumers. I want to get BPW.
Yeah.
There's a rule that says that if there's a building and it was served by one of the utilities, it will always be served by that utilities. If you build a new building, then if you have other choices, you can pick. And for example, when Bay Meadows, many of people here were here when Bay Meadows was built, BPW ran lines out to service Bay Meadows. And so it's a historical thing, and that's state law is what controls that.
Okay. And just a follow-up on battery technology. How are batteries comparing, for example, to the Chinese, and particularly for EVs? Are ours getting a lot better?
So utility batteries are dramatically different than EV batteries. You know, Tesla's made a big business. For example, there's a company called, they're making an iron battery. So in a car, you have a battery that you want it to last a few hours, you know, whatever. A utility, you want a battery that discharges over a week. Okay. And so there's a company, Form Energy. Form Energy has designed a battery that the chemical process is rust and unrusting. And so you charge it and the anodes or I don't remember which, rust. And that stores the energy. And then when you want to release it, the rust goes away. And they're massive. They're not expensive. But they've just built, I can't remember, a multi-million-dollar factory because they've proven the technology and they're now starting to deploy. So the lithium batteries, like you see in cars, that's being used as well. That's what's coming out of LG. But there's there's compressed air. So we got a cavern and we push a bunch of compressed air through solar, whatever, wind, and we pump the air down into the earth. And then when you want to disperse it, you let the air come out and drive a generator. There are so many different developments going on with batteries right now. It's crazy. I mean, I can tell you a few, but I don't know them all. And so it's a huge investment in our country and the world. Yes.
Dave over here. So a comment about that down the street, literally at the Michigan State University
Yep.
Bioeconomics Institute.
Yes.
There is a lot of research being done there, as we have heard here in the Haas classroom, on building better batteries for utilities, for municipalities to use to store energy. Dave, we have a question here.
Yes.
Yeah. A few years ago, the people were going around out west and popping the insulators on utilities. I can't remember what their beef was.
Yeah, I know some of those stories.
Yeah. Is that still going on, or?
Yes. There's the most famous one was those giant transformers have to be cooled. And so there's oil floating around to cool, and they have fins on them. And so there was a major substation, the south end of Silicon Valley, that controls a lot of the energy coming into Silicon Valley. They cut down got dug into manholes, cut the fiber optic lines so they couldn't see the monitoring. And then they sat on a hill with rifles and shot into the fins so that they shot down the cooling and and drove that substation out. And so they were able to recover it. But and I've had this conversation with BPW, folks at BPW, and it said, because we have cameras on all the substations and so forth. And their comment is, we aren't a big enough deal to be a target. But there's some major substations around the country that are very critical. And so and a lot of utilities are changing and putting more rigorous walls around and so forth. There's a lot of activity in that area because of just that risk.
Who are these people that are doing that? Do we know?
I don't know, but I know and particularly in the case of the San Diego thing, they never figured out who it was.
At your next board meeting, can you please pass along our thanks for keeping our bills low?
So here's another thing why I like BPW a lot. And again, it's not a commercial, but so think about this. They built a substation for LG. LG is going to be far exceed any of the other manufacturers in the area. So one of the things that a utility evaluates is how do they protect the ratepayers? So if we had to create so much generation capability to service LG, and then somebody in South Korea decides, we're going to close that plant. And so then we have this enormous generation asset that now the ratepayers are going to have to pay for that. So what they did was, it's really creative. They took a look at what the demand is from, Heinz and all the different companies in the area. And they said, okay, up to about, I think it's 30 megawatts, maybe 40 megawatts. No, I think it's 30. There's a thing called rate K. And if you pay, if you are in that range and nobody's close to that 30 except for LG, you're going to pay our normal rates. If you're above that, any energy you use above that, you're going to pay the market rate, whatever the daily rate is out on the market. So that way, LG's paying their fair share. They get a good discount. But if they're going to become that big, BPW doesn't have to build the facilities to provide that. They get it. They have to go and negotiate for it, buy it on the market. Pretty smart. And so anyhow, there's constant conversations of how do we do the right thing to encourage business in the area, but protect our ratepayers if things were to go awry. So, yes, sir.
Maybe go back a little bit to your IT background, but
Yes.
There's always, every once in a while, there's articles about cybersecurity and the sensitivity of, this is obviously a huge complex system.
Yeah.
And I'm sure computers are highly involved.
Oh, yeah.
Comments about that?
There's a whole, so in my working career, one of the things that got me really involved in this is I had a computer system that processed about 30 million credit cards and debit cards a year. And in the retail world, that was a huge target. The hackers always wanted to get a hold of everybody's credit card numbers. That made me, and then one of my buddies in another retailer, he, through neglect, and he was a smart guy and had a good department, he exposed 4.2 million credit cards. He had lost his job as a CIO and never worked as a CIO the rest of his career. That was in 2007. 2010, another buddy from another retailer, actually Snooks in St. Louis, he lost 2.5 million credit cards and lost his job and never worked as a CIO again. That made me incredibly paranoid. And my security person in that department had about 8 people doing that stuff. And I said, whatever this guy says we do, that's what we do. And so in the utility world, my other little joke I always said, when I had to report to the board of directors a couple of times a year, once on projects, once on cybersecurity. And I always said, because they give me a hard time and so forth. I said, my plan is to retire on my schedule, not your schedule. Anyhow, there's a very robust security operation that are imposed upon utilities. And as they get bigger and are more complex, so and NERC, the firm or the organization I talked about, they manage all that. And so I've seen the documentation, and I know what the credit card companies imposed upon us is very robust. It's very, but people are always poking, and there's. Well, we do have, seeing how I warned everybody this would happen. They had a hard time convincing utilities about how early on. And so there's a test facility out in the Midwest somewhere, and they took one of these big circuit breakers. What's that? Oh, sorry. And there's software, and the utility guys, they can't mess with us. Well, they showed them how they could go in and control. a hacker could get in and control this circuit breaker for this generator. So they fired up this diesel generator, the 60 cycles. Remember the 60 cycles. When you bring something online, you have to make sure it's synchronized to that 60 cycle. Because if you try and introduce it out of sync with that 60 cycle, it's not a good thing. And so they showed how a hacker could get into this. They fired up this diesel generator and for a test bed, and they showed how they could change the programming of the circuit breaker to keep throwing that diesel generator onto the grid, not into their test grid, out of sync with that 60 cycle. And they kept doing it and kept doing it. And so smoke started coming out, the thing would wrench, it fell off anyhow, they destroyed the generator. The folks that came out of that, okay, we get it now. And that happened, I don't know, 15 years ago, and that got the message across. You got to take it seriously. So they take it very seriously. Yes, sir.
One of the biggest issues that's facing us is that there is a marked lack of energy supply in this country for this foreseeable future, and so the big question that's out there is how are we going to meet that? My brother works for a company that sells the backup batteries for data centers.
Oh, yeah.
And these
Yep.
huge arrays.
Yeah, I used to have a bunch.
As you know, they're designed to work for 2 or 3 minutes before the generators can kick in on that.
Yes,
He said demand is crazy.
it is.
It just, he's busier than busy in selling these systems and that. And he said, right now, people do not have a plan to meet the demand of these big data centers, particularly as AI increasingly comes online for all kinds of things.
Yep.
What do you foresee in the future for that?
I was hoping somebody would ask this question because there's great investments, by the way. So a broad stroke comment to start with. Utilities have been, first of all, LED bulbs is probably decrease the demand in this country by about 10%, electrical demand. It's an amazing effect. And my point is just one point, and the efficiency, the Energy Star program, which our wonderful administration just canceled, all these things have generated a lot more efficiency in the environment, in the grid. And so the grid has not had to deal with large increases in demand that you're speaking of. The grid is generally run by a conservative lot, engineers, smart folks, but conservative. And so now, to your point, these AI data centers, when they're cranking them full of thousands of NVIDIA chips, have huge demands. And because of the past nuclear experience, and it gets a little overplayed, utilities are very cautious about investing in nuclear because most of the nuclear plants that exist are one-offs. And so they never got the efficiency of design, of a standardized design, a modular design. And that's where small modular nuclear reactors, I'll be talking about that next year, are coming into play. And so the utilities are not excited about nuclear, but the Microsoft, Meta, Google, they're all putting in power purchase agreements for either old nuclear plants or having them build new nuclear plants. And so there's a whole lot of work that's going on that's going to create that energy. It takes time. And so the utilities are waking up to the fact that they have to change and they've got to be more aggressive at it. And so is there a magic bullet? No, but there's a lot of change going on in the industry right now.
I have one more question here.
I hear from you that in the next 20 years, perhaps the storage battery facilities for larger facilities like consumers is going to be a major growth area.
Absolutely
Is that what you're
correct.
saying?
Yes, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct.
Got a question combining the electrical power and IT also. I've heard something on, I think NPR in the last few days that these data centers are being built near cheap sources of power.
Yeah.
But once they get up and running and those data centers need to communicate over the internet, the internet infrastructure is not where those cheap power sources are, perhaps out west in hydro and electric. And
Yeah.
how is that going to get resolved?
Well, my comment about that is all about design. And so if you're going to build it, and I built data centers, I didn't build anything like the data centers that you hear about. I built business data centers, a couple different ones, Hewlett Packard and a couple others. Anyhow, it's all about design. So if you have to look at all the factors. So communications in my business, we had 170 stores and 22 warehouses. So the communication network was critical. And so when you do a design, you have to make sure that you have enough, in the case of internet, enough trunk capacity to be able to support what goes on in that data center. And so that's an example of poor design or poor thinking. And so there's no problem there other than somebody wasn't thinking through all the dynamics of it. You made me think of something else. So on my computer side of the house, there's all this betting on AI. And AI when they call it AI, if you talk about serious AI, that's not what this is. These are large language models. They're neural networks. They're smart and they can do some things, but there's a lot of their innards that people don't totally, they'll come up with a wrong answer. Well, why did that come up with a wrong answer? This isn't artificial intelligence like it's going to take over the population and so forth. They're way, decades and decades away from that. So don't be misled. And a lot of these, when they call it HI, the press likes to sell whatever. So it's much more embryonic than you think. And a lot of people are building these data centers. I'm not saying that they won't get used or whatever, but there's a lot of speculation. And there was a study done that the grid, they said, I can't remember what the numbers are, but let's say it was 100 gigawatts or something. It's some large number that they were trying to get in the queue to get interconnected to these parts of the grid. Well, as they looked at it closer, only about half of them will actually get built. And so there's a lot of publicity that's going on. And I mean, certainly these big data centers are going to be built, and there's lots of positives, there's noise, there's negatives, lots of different things. And you'll hear lots of press talking about different parts of it. But some of it gets overblown as to, again, not like I say, I'm not saying it's big, but sometimes it gets blown up a little bit bigger than expected. But my other comment is that with these data centers, it's the tech companies that are saying we're going to invest in the more sophisticated nuclear. I'll just real close on small modular nuclear reactors. The idea behind these is they're repeatable. It's the same design. The thing fits on the back of a flatbed truck, and they can turn it up and line up several of them and be able to, unlike the old style where you crank it up and it runs, these modules, you can turn them on and turn them off. And so they're more flexible, that we talked about the needs. There's a lot of work going on in that area, but what's funding it is the tech companies because they know they need it. And so anyhow, in Palisades, Holtec, they're going to put once they fire that baby back up, they're going to put in small modular nuclear reactors there. So anyhow, sorry, I'm rambling.
But it's important. The technology in the new modular units is very different from the major plants that we're familiar with built 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Yes.
They are much safer.
Oh, yeah.
In their operation than what we're familiar with.
Yeah, a perfect example in that particular case. When you built a nuclear power plant, they had to have a 50-mile accident plan, a 10-mile accident plan, and so forth to evacuate people and so forth. With small modular nuclear reactors, it's just the property they sit on because it's just not their design is fundamentally you turn them off and they just cool down. You don't have to have all these backup systems and so forth. It's much simpler design. I'll talk about that next year. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question about, so the Northwest, which has historically relied on hydropower,
Yes.
dams, et cetera, so much better, dismantling dams for environmental reasons.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering, what's their plan? Which options are they using to make up for the loss of that?
I know that there's a municipal power. I just saw a presentation about it in a class that I took. That there's a municipal organization of several states up in Washington State, and they're deploying. They have dams. They have several nuclear facilities. They're putting in a small modular nuclear reactor system to help compensate. Beyond that, I don't know. Well, who knows?
Okay, I think we're going to cut it off unless you have
Does
any
anybody have
question?
more questions?
One more question?
Well, Blendon Township has been in the news lately with battery storage.
Oh, yes, they have. Yes.
Any comments?
That's a relatively small implementation. Other than sort of it's not invented here and I don't want it in my backyard. I don't have any other comment. It's just like MISO wants to put a 345 volt transmission line from northern Indiana up to east of Lansing. And there's people are, I don't want on my farmland and so forth. And when they put in those new transmission facilities, normally it takes about 10 years to fight all the lawsuits and so forth. It's just the nature of the human condition, I guess. So beyond that, I don't know the details.
Okie dokie. I just want to let everybody know this is what our dinner discussion is like every night. And I'm not joking either. But
The only thing that saved me is I met her in a computer center. So.
But I have no knowledge of electricity, but I do all the other tech stuff. But anyway, and Dave has to head over to a Holland BPW board meeting shortly. So we're going to have to let him go. But thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much, David, for doing this today. You go ahead.
Yes.
I'm a retired nuclear engineer with the Navy. So I was just visiting my boss who helped design the NuScale.
Oh, really?